Okay, let's get started. We are on lecture 20, and we will be jumping into discussion public goods, corruption, and ethnic divisions for the next 3 lectures. How did it go on Thursday with Marshall? Is it okay? Am I going to lose my job? Was it that good? No, he has a great paper, and his figures and tables and everything are always really, really cool. So all the visual kind of geocoded stuff and everything. So great. Cool. Midterms, I think, have been passed back. The mean and median were around 16. Standard deviation around 4.6. Maybe that mean or median makes you feel better. Maybe not. Of course, everything's graded on a curve, so it was just a low mean. Problem set 3 will be passed out later this week and then due in a week. And that'll be the last problem set. Any questions before I get started? Yeah. Can somebody close the door? Actually, there's a lot of people talking right outside. Someone can close it. Thanks a lot. Sorry, say that again. You mean in terms of preparing for the final, or? I think it'll be similar in that there'll be some essay and then some econometric and some theory on the final. So it'll be split between between those. I think a good rule of thumb is to spend roughly, if there's a certain question that's a certain proportion of points, as a rough estimate, to spend roughly that proportion of time on that question. Now, if you're a little faster with one type of question or another, you may allocate your time a little differently. But that's a good starting point to think of. Yeah. Yeah, the final will be cumulative, weighed a bit more heavily towards the second half of the course. But I will still have some material from the first half of the course. So the final may be 60 to 70% on the second half of the course, something like that. A little bit more on the second half. Okay, so I want to transition to the next theme in the course. In my lecture last Tuesday, we were going through instrumental variables. We went through almost all of it. There were a few slides left. In section, the GSIs are going to go more through instrumental variables. You'll get to finish some of that material. So I want to talk about corruption today. And corruption is a topic that is very often discussed in the context of development. People see it as being very central to development problems and challenges. So we're going to spend some time discussing it. And to start off, just to illustrate how corruption can affect economic outcomes and lives in a very important way, we'll draw on an example very closely linked to the economic shocks section of the course that we just finished. So for instance, think back to the problem we've discussed a lot this term about how there's very high year-to-year variation or variability in rainfall in many African countries. And the problems that poses for households. One way to deal with those problems is to save some of your grain, your food production, from year to year. So that would be a really obvious way to help you deal with the problem that maybe one year you have a good year and the next year is a bad year. It turns out, if you study how best to store grain, some people store it in their homes. If you study how best to store grain, there's a number of reasons why it might actually make sense to store it centrally. In other words, for me not just to store 2 bags in my home and you to store 2 bags in your home, etc. It may make sense to take advantage of economies of scale in storage. What are those economies of scale? So one has to do with the treatment of the grain. When you store grain and you want it to last for a year, in many African settings where there's a lot of moisture, where there's different types of pests and whatnot that get in the grain, you want to fumigate the grain. You treat it. You basically, there's chemicals and you fumigate an area with this kind of gas that kills the pests in the grain. And doing that makes the grain last a lot longer. And there's types of treatments that people have today that don't have any lasting taste or lasting health consequences that we know of. So that's a pretty typical thing to do. You can see immediately why there's economies of scale. You need a machine, a fumigation machine. You need the chemicals. And if you fumigate a small room or medium-sized room, all those fixed costs are going to be the same. Or even a large room, the fixed costs would be the same. So it's actually much cheaper to put together 100 bags of grain rather than 2 and fumigate all of them at once. There's other reasons why there might be economies of scale. Security. If we each have lots of bags of grain in our home or in a back hut, etc., all of us may be subject to theft. If instead we put 100 bags or 500 bags in a warehouse with 1 security guard, they can probably guard all that grain at once. So there's a number of reasons why you might think it's efficient to pool your grain together. And of course, you guys are all familiar, maybe not because you see them here, but you've seen them in books or read about them or seen them in movies, what grain silos look like in the Midwest of the US. These huge storage facilities for grain exist in the US because lots of different farmers will often store their grain in one place. And that's been true even historically. Okay, so we might want to store our grain together. But in Meatu district in Tanzania, the same district where the witch killings took place and take place, there were no centralized grain stores. So when I started working there, we started collecting data. We learned about all the drought years and all this variability. We learned about all the scale economies, and we said, why isn't there any centralized storage? People could actually do this quite efficiently. No one was doing this. And this actually is going to bring us to our first clicker question. So you can get out your clicker once it loads up. It's just loading up. There it is. So here we go. Hold on. Which of the following reasons do you think are most likely for why there are no centralized grain storage facilities in this district? Maybe are the long-term benefits of grain storage just overrated? Maybe it really isn't that advantageous to store grain from year to year? Are the transportation costs of bringing the grain from different farms to the central facility very high? Is it hard to kind of get them there? Is there a lack of private entrepreneurs that can even manage a grain store at all? And finally, is there a lack of trust in government-run grain storage schemes, or maybe all of the above? Yeah. So what I mean by A is maybe we think storing grain is really good, but maybe it's not such a big deal. Maybe people don't really need to store their grain. Okay, so let's give it another 5 seconds. Okay, so what do people think? So you guys have very reasonable answers. Maybe we're wrong and the benefits are smaller than we think. I think most of us would think the benefits are pretty good. Transport costs could certainly be an issue. You have to get grain from your village to, say, the district capital or to a bigger town. Very few people have cars. That said, a lot of people have bikes and very often go to central markets once a week for market. So it's not clear it's super expensive to bring 1 sack of grain, say, to grain storage, but it could still be an issue. Lack of good private entrepreneurs. There's a lot of small businesses. This one is the one when we talk to people that seemed the most salient, which is sort of lack of trust in some of the government schemes. So let me tell you more about the history of that. In other words, economic factors like rates of return, entrepreneurship, or all these other things may not have been most central. In our discussions with people, it seemed like trust and governance related to corruption was actually the most central explanation. So what happened? It actually turned out there had been a very big, serious effort in the 1970s in Tanzania to build grain stores, to build these, people call them stores, sorry, I realize I'm using an East African term, grain storage facilities. People call it a store. Not like a store where you buy grain. A grain store is just a place where you store grain. So grain storage facility, let's say. But people call them grain stores. They're not stores like shops. Is that clear? Were you all like, yeah, why are they selling in stores? No, grain storage areas. Sorry. So there had actually been an attempt to build these grain storage facilities in Tanzania in the 70s. The government then was basically a dictatorship, a socialist dictatorship, and they said, hey, it's economically efficient to build these grain storage facilities, and they built a bunch of them. And they actually kind of pressured and forced people to store their grain in the grain storage buildings. Well, what happened? It turned out that a lot of the grain that was stored in the 1970s, especially in the late 70s, got stolen. So the government sort of forced people to store their grain, explained all the benefits to them, and then some local government officials stole the grain. And people lost their crop. Now, once that happens, even if it was decades ago, you can imagine the next time a local government official says, I've got this grain storage building over here. Why don't you just bring your grain here? It'll be cool. I got it. You might hesitate, and you might say, maybe I won't bring my grain. Maybe I'll just keep it at home. I won't be able to fumigate it. I don't know about security, but I'm not too happy about security in that government-run grain storage facility either. So, there was this incredible lack of trust in any kind of centrally organized grain storage scheme. This is a potential economic cost of corruption. If government officials hadn't stolen the grain, if this was a low corruption setting, people might be able to take advantage of all those economies of scale in grain storage, store more grain, deal with economic shocks better, and basically have higher living standards. But they can't because they don't trust the government to provide this public service. So this is one concrete way that corruption can be very costly. Now, what we started thinking about, and I was working with an NGO at the time, is how could you set up something that people would have faith in? We didn't really trust the government to do it because people didn't trust the government. How could you get people to trust you? The technology side of it's pretty straightforward. You buy the fumigation machine, you rent a space, you actually have to store the grain above the ground. You buy these wooden sort of like planks that are above ground. You don't want it to be right on the ground because then rats or mice can eat the grain. There's just stuff everybody knows you have to do to store grain. So you can do that. But how could you get people to trust you enough to leave the grain with you? Yeah. Very possibly. We asked that question. And we said, why don't any private entrepreneurs do this? And the feeling was, private entrepreneurs would feel a lot of pressure in the hungry season to release grain. It's really a question, you could think of it as a question of property rights to some extent. Private entrepreneurs, the grain storage area might be kind of there might be burglaries to take grain back. If prices went up a lot, there'd be a lot of pressure on them not to be hoarding or speculating with grain and to release the grain. So private entrepreneurs basically didn't find it in their interest to do it. So the government option was out, and private didn't seem that attractive. Yeah. This was one of the things we grappled with, and I'll tell you about an NGO project that I worked on. When we first started talking about the technology, it's more technologically efficient to just pool all the grain together. To put it in a sort of big vat, fumigate it. No farmer wanted to do that. Different farmers have different, for their maize, the corn or the sorghum that they grow, they have particular varieties that they grow that they like. They're not sure if they trust what their neighbors are growing. They were also afraid that their neighbors might mix rocks in their bag of maize to make it weigh more, et cetera, and then sort of mix that into the pile. So people wanted their own grain. That was one constraint. They didn't trust the government to do it, and private entrepreneurs said basically it's not profitable for me to do it. Yeah. Yeah, I guess very few people here grow grain. So for farmers themselves, I'm not sure what farmers do, like maize, corn farmers in the Midwest, if they eat their own corn or if they just sell all of it and just buy it from the store. But I think there, since 85% of people are growing their own food, they felt very much attached to the food they had grown. So they wanted their own sack of grain. So we worked with this NGO to set up a grain storage facility, and we came up with some solutions. So for instance, people would drop the grain off in their own bag, and we would tag it with their name and leave it in a locked facility. Now, when the NGO first started doing this, people still didn't trust that their grain was there. So the way it worked is the door to this facility, we basically had installed this metal grating door, so you could look in through the gaps and see your bag of grain, because people wanted to know that their bag of grain was there and hadn't been stolen. So that was one solution. And then there was one day a week where an NGO staff person would go to this village, open the door, had an account book where you could deposit bags of grain or take out your bags of grain just so they could keep track of it. On other days, you couldn't do it because it wasn't being staffed. It was just a building there. And then the building was fumigated, but fumigation doesn't work as well through bags, but it works pretty well. So the idea was it was good enough for most people to fumigate in that way. Now, initially, very few people wanted to put their grain there. They didn't know what to make of this NGO. The NGO had done some health and education projects, so they were basically well-liked, but they were kind of a small NGO. But over the course of the year, the number of people who were storing grain rose and rose, and they kept doing this for a couple years. So by a couple years later, a very large number of households started storing grain, and the NGO set up actually multiple grain storage sites in this district. So it was actually possible to set up grain storage, fumigate, and get some of the benefits of saving, but it wasn't obvious. Government couldn't do it, private sector couldn't do it. There had to be this kind of very particular set of arrangements, what grain you get back, what was visible, et cetera, that kind of made it possible. And those kinds of conditions may differ from place to place. Different farmers may want different things or expect different things. And this sort of opens up a question, why did the NGO succeed? Why did people end up trusting the NGO? I mean, the NGO could have stolen the grain too. Why did people do it? Do folks have any thoughts on this? Yeah. I think so. I think the whole kind of multi-year piloting and gradual scaling up was really an exercise in showing communities in this area that the NGO was serious about dealing with their concerns. And even these design features where you could always look in and see your bag of grain gave people a lot of confidence, basically, in what was going on. Do folks have any other thoughts? Go ahead. Yeah. That's okay. Take both of you. No problem. Yeah, why did this work when no one trusted the government to do it? Why did it sort of take off with an NGO? What's different about an NGO? Yeah. So, that's right. So maybe there was more trust just because this NGO hadn't screwed people over or something. So they kind of felt more trust in it. That's interesting. So you can imagine that there's more accountability, you're saying, for the NGO, whereas the government is sort of unaccountable. Some might argue the opposite. Like, if the government screws me over, I can vote, I can protest the government, whereas the NGO can just skip town. But I think what you're saying will resonate with a lot of people. The NGO is this small actor. If they kind of screw over some communities, you can get the government to sort of crack down on the NGO, take away their license or something. So in that sense, maybe the government could help you sort of provide some accountability to NGO action. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Governments could, but maybe they typically don't. Maybe they don't take those concerns into account. Maybe it's more bureaucratic. The question was raised before about the private sector. I haven't gone to Meow2 in a number of years now. When I was last there 5, 6 years ago, there had not been an increase in private sector storage. But maybe over time, the successful sort of NGO model would inspire some entrepreneurs to set up businesses as well. Like the NGO didn't have a profit motive. They took a few years to figure out this business model, basically, that worked. Maybe now it could be replicated by the private sector. And I think part of the reason people trust NGOs is they know there's really no profit motive. So with private entrepreneurs, they may fear they're getting screwed over, basically. And with the government, they didn't trust the government. So the NGO had this sort of unusual status of being much more flexible than the government, but people feeling like they weren't out to get them, which they might with some private entrepreneurs. So there's these different actors at play. Okay, that said, and then we'll move on from this example. There are a number of prominent cases, not with this NGO, but with other NGOs, of corruption within NGOs too. So there's certainly tons of corruption in NGOs, just as there's corruption in government. And so we can't just assume NGOs will always do the right thing. Yeah. You're saying the NGOs basically subsidizing it? Or? Yeah, so the fees were very low, basically, the NGO said. And I think they wanted to get people, they wanted low fees to get people in the system and show them that it could work. And maybe that is a difference. Maybe eventually private entrepreneurs, basically the NGO was making a loss on the grain storage. They were willing to subsidize it because they thought the benefits to these communities were large enough that it was worth doing that. Whereas private entrepreneurs may not be willing to subsidize that. So I think that's another way that NGOs more like the government. Governments do subsidize all kinds of things, so they find it worthwhile. Okay. So that's an illustration of how corruption works on the ground with this one example in this one setting you guys are familiar with. But governance issues and corruption can affect development outcomes in many other ways. And we're going to sort of speak about these things more broadly now. There is this perception that corruption is a major impediment to development. Lots of the major development organizations, like the World Bank, emphasize this. I think one of the really concrete ways to think about corruption is it makes government policy and government programs less effective. That's just a simple way of thinking about it. If a government wants to implement a certain program, like assisting certain community schools, or building grain stores, or building roads, if there's a lot of corruption, all of those interventions will be carried out less effectively. So governments won't really have as much capacity to do what they want to do if lots of funding is getting siphoned off along the way. So that's one way to think very concretely about the development impact. Okay, so what is corruption? Let's step back. There's a lot of different definitions or views about what constitutes corruption and why it might matter. One definition that's very widely used, and I think it is used partially by this group called Transparency International, which is a prominent sort of anti-corruption campaigning NGO, is the abuse of public office for private gain. So that's a very broad definition. When you think corruption, you might think, oh, someone took a bribe, somebody embezzled money, like some very specific action. But what they're saying is, look, corruption is abusing your position to benefit yourself in a way that's really not appropriate given your job title and given what your goals and responsibilities are. So I don't need to take money to be corrupt. I can take favors in other forms. I can benefit friends. I can do other things that benefit me privately, but really are an abuse of public office. So bribery is the most obvious example. Let's say I'm issuing business licenses in a certain city, and I'm supposed to issue a license to any business that pays $50 in rural Tanzania. If I make you pay a bribe of $500 to issue that license, I'm really subverting the goal of that policy. There may be a policy to make it really cheap and easy to set up a business, and now I put barriers in the way of potential entrepreneurs. So that has an economic impact, and it clearly benefits me. Now, sometimes, and people have written about this in many cases, there are sort of regulations or what people call red tape that at first glance don't seem to make much sense. There's regulations or red tape that seem burdensome, bureaucratic, wasteful, et cetera, and they make no sense until you see them as just one component of a corruption system. So again, if I'm a government official who's trying to maximize the number of bribes I can get, it's completely in my interest to set up as much red tape, as many barriers, as many regulations, as many forms as you need to fill in as possible. So everybody's been in the position of having to fill in forms maybe at different points, and it seems irrational until you realize you can cut through all of that by paying a bribe. I was trying to get a passport. My mother's an immigrant. I was trying to get a passport from her home country in New York, and the requirements were just remarkable. I mean, the number of forms, and so we spent a day, we filled in all these forms. The passport photo requirements were like 3 pages, single space. These are all the things that a passport photo needs to have. We took like the perfect passport photo. We took it like 7 times. It was perfect. We showed up with all the paperwork, and the official at the consulate in New York was very upset. I mean, we had really put time into this application. She was scrutinizing the photo. And then she says, by your left ear, I see a slight shadow. And I thought, no, look, it's perfect. I mean, we literally got the perfect photo. I said, no. My friend, 2 blocks from here, always takes a perfect passport photo. Go to my friend and get the passport photo. Okay, maybe we have to do that. Then there were some other forms. This form, you're supposed to order them in this order. You had stacked the forms this way. Some of the other stuff is out of order. My friend in Brooklyn, who's a lawyer, always makes sure that the forms are in. I mean, this is in the US, now. So after like 3 of these, we just said, screw it, I don't want the passport. Like, this is just too burdensome. But sometimes you need these things to get done. We could have cut through all this by going to her friends, figuring out some way to sort of do favors for her, and we basically were unwilling to do so because we didn't need this passport. But in many other cases, it may be a very life or death situation, a critical situation where you just need to go into a corruption system and get things done by bribing or sort of going along with these kinds of demands. Has anybody ever had an experience like this in their own life of just endless red tape and obviously not counting Berkeley, where such things happen all the time, probably, but the bureaucracy. I've had friends in India who have said they've demanded, they wanted to pay their taxes with local tax offices and been prevented from doing so because they were unwilling to pay bribes to sort of pay their